Disaster at Christmas. Pan Am 103 never makes it home.
From ABC, this is World News Tonight with Peter Jennings.
Good evening. The simple facts are these. Pan Am's Flight 103 had been in the air for an hour. The 747 was en route from London to New York and then Detroit. According to Pan American, there were more than 240 passengers on board and a crew of 15. It was after dark. For reasons we do not yet understand, the plane with 50,000 gallons of fuel on board plunged into a small Scottish market town. Pan American is not aware that any of the passengers or crew has survived. Our first report is from ABC's Barry Dunsmore.
The first pictures from the scene show strings of houses on fire. Eyewitnesses say the plane hit a gas station and several houses. Others talked of a rumbling and then a terrible explosion.
Dozens of houses are burning, and the fire brigade are being hampered in their attempts to put out the fires by the risk of a further explosion from the petrol station, which the Pan Am Jumbo hit as it crashed into the town.
Rescue services have taken a dozen people to an area hospital. They are believed to be local people suffering from burns. There is no word, but little hope for the passengers.
There's very little hope, I would have thought, for anybody who was in that plane. When it did come to earth, as people have described locally, with an enormous flash of flame, it hit very hard.
Pan Am Flight 103 originated in Frankfurt, West Germany. There was a plane change to the 747 in London. 54 minutes after the plane took off, flying at 31,000 feet, it disappeared from radar screens in Scotland. Shortly after, it was seen crashing into the Scottish town of Lockerbie, near Scotland's border with England. In New York, a Pan Am spokesman said there was no contact with the aircraft before it crashed.
As I said, there was no prior indication that there were any problems with the aircraft. There was no contact prior, any Mayday signals. The aircraft had made normal contact with the control center.
More than a dozen rescue helicopters have been dispatched to the area, while the main highway between Scotland and England has been closed. The town center of Lockerbie is littered with debris. And it's also understood that the cockpit of the plane hit another town about 6 miles away. This may account for the fact that some people think there were two planes and two explosions. However, the RAF has ruled out any military plane, and it doesn't seem likely a civilian plane would have been that high. An official of Jane's All the World's Aircraft has told us tonight that given the spread of the debris, it certainly seems as though there was an implosion, which would have been caused by a structural failure, or an explosion caused perhaps by a bomb. Peter?
Okay, Barry Dunsmore in London, thanks very much. There is as yet no indication, as you've heard there, that the pilot of the 747 alerted ground controllers there was any emergency. Even though one eyewitness said, seen from the ground, it was like a rain of fire. In the cold world of the radar screen, Flight 103 was suddenly just no longer a blip. If the particular suddenness with which this happened is a clue, the experts have not said so yet. ABC's Jim Slade has a report.
On a normal course, a 747 leaving Heathrow for New York would have climbed to 30,000 feet or above by the time Flight 103 disappeared from radar scopes. It would also have been very heavily fueled. Boeing Commercial Aircraft in Seattle say this particular plane was the 15th 747 off their assembly line in 1970, was delivered to Pan Am in February of that year. However, this plane was structurally reinforced for possible military service. Since it was scheduled to cross the Atlantic tonight, it was probably fueled to or near capacity. That means it was still heavily fueled at the time of the crash, adding to the explosion. British authorities say the plane's crew made no comment on the radio, indicating whatever happened took place suddenly without warning. Military authorities there indicate there's no suggestion of another plane in the vicinity, seemingly ruling out a mid-air collision, but that's being investigated. The U.S. National Transportation Safety Board, which investigates all accidents involving American aircraft, is sending one man tonight and will send a full team of experts as needed. Boeing's getting up its own team. The FAA is sending people, and the FBI is waiting for developments that might indicate sabotage before sending anyone. All in all, the 747 has a good track record. Most of the accidents involving them have had external causes. 2 747s were destroyed in a runway collision in the Canary Islands. A Japan Airlines 747 crashed when a cracked bulkhead gave way from damage on takeoff. Tonight, the puzzle is what happened at 31,000 feet over Scotland. Peter?
Jim, it's my own experience that there's enormous speculation at the time of air crashes, and reporters almost invariably turn out to be wrong.
You're absolutely correct. There is no way at this point to guess what happened aboard that aircraft. And every time you try to decide from the looks of the thing what happened, you find out in the conclusion of the investigation you were wrong.
Okay, Jim Slade in Washington, thanks very much. Just to reaffirm that Pan Am said just a short while ago that as far as it's aware, there were no survivors on board the aircraft. We have been told from a variety of sources that among the people on board were a number of Syracuse University students who were returning from London, where Syracuse University has an overseas program, that the United Nations Commissioner for Namibia, formerly Southwest Africa, Bernd Carlson, was also reportedly on the plane. And there have been a number of unconfirmed reports, and I emphasize unconfirmed here, that also on board were a number of U.S. servicemen who were coming back from overseas for Christmas. In a moment, the day's other news. The securities firm Drexel Burnham Lambert, a $650 million fine. And later in the broadcast, an experimental new way to fight cancer. On the American agenda, how to teach children about science.
This is World News Tonight with Peter Jennings. Brought to you by Tots Champagne.
The U.S. Army has today arrested one of its own on suspicion of espionage. Warrant Officer First Class James Hall was arrested after a search of his home in Georgia. More from ABC's Dennis Trout.
Hall is being held at Fort Stewart, Georgia, where he's been serving in the intelligence section of the 24th Infantry Division. Army officials say they've had him under surveillance since last summer. Sources say Hall was spying for East Germany, both from the U.S. and from West Germany, where he was stationed for 8 of the last 12 years. Hall's specialties are electronic warfare and signal intelligence, and he holds a top-secret security clearance. Government officials believe he was selling American codes and ciphers, the keys to decoding messages, for up to several $100,000. Analysts say that not only was U.S. information compromised, but reworking those U.S. codes will be expensive.
If in fact he's been giving codes and ciphers in the late 1980s, this is going to cost us dearly into the 1990s.
Hall's big spending habits helped tip officials off to possible wrongdoing, but neighbors found nothing suspicious about Hall and his family.
They appear to be a very nice family. They've got 2 children who've played with our children. You know, I've noticed nothing unusual about the family.
This is the latest in a series of military spy cases in recent years. The John Walker espionage ring, uncovered in 1985, had delivered Navy codes and information on ship movements to the Soviets. Retired Sergeant Clyde Lee Conrad was accused this summer of selling secret information on NATO troop deployments to the East Bloc. While authorities don't think this newly discovered conspiracy is as big or damaging as the Walker espionage organization was, they have arrested a Turkish man believed to be Hall's handler and courier. He's in custody in Tampa, Florida, and officials still are investigating to see whether any others might have been involved. Dennis Trout, ABC News, Washington.
The other shoe dropped on Wall Street today, and it was a large one. Drexel Burnham Lambert, the firm that virtually created junk bonds, has reached a deal with federal prosecutors. The firm will plead guilty to 6 felony counts and pay a staggering $650 million in fines. Here's our business correspondent, Stephen Ogg.
The $650 million is the biggest settlement yet in a government securities fraud case. And it comes after a 2-year investigation based on tips provided by Ivan Boesky, the convicted stock speculator who paid a $100 million penalty 2 years ago. He's been cooperating with federal investigators ever since. Until recently, Drexel had refused to settle because it would have involved pleading guilty to criminal charges. But just this evening, Drexel Chief Executive Fred Joseph explained why the firm changed its mind.
To fight this through in a court battle would have taken many more years and tremendous diversion of resources.
U.S. Attorney Rudolph Giuliani said Drexel had agreed to plead guilty to 6 felony counts of mail fraud, wire fraud, and securities fraud. And the $650 million covers criminal fines, civil penalties, giving up any illegal profits it made, and future compensation to those who can prove that Drexel's misdeeds caused them financial damage. The agreement, said to be just an agreement in principle, depends on Drexel settling a civil case filed by the Securities and Exchange Commission last September. At the time, the SEC accused Drexel of a wide variety of crimes, including insider trading, stock manipulation, fraud against its own clients, failure to disclose its ownership of stocks in connection with takeovers, and other violations. The Drexel case arises from the firm's business of junk bonds, which are a form of corporate IOUs used to finance big business takeovers. Left unanswered in today's announcement is the future of the founder of the firm's junk bond business, the man who built Drexel into the powerhouse it is today, Michael Milken, a major target of the government investigation. Stephen Ogg, ABC News, Washington.
A federal judge ruled today that the trial of Oliver North will finally begin on the 31st of January. North is charged with diverting millions of dollars from Iranian arms sales for the use of the Nicaraguan countries. President Reagan continues to say his goodbyes. Today he sat down with David Brinkley for an interview which we broadcast tomorrow night. There have been reports that Libya is on the verge of being able to manufacture poison gas. And David asked Mr. Reagan if the United States might bomb the factory where the gas is allegedly made.
Well, let me say that's a decision that has not been made yet. We're in communication with our allies and with NATO forces and all. And we're watching very closely that situation. But even if I had made a decision, I couldn't.
You wouldn't want to tell it now?
No.
And it has been discussed with the Allies?
We are, it isn't have been, we are discussing with them. And we want to pin down completely so that there is no question but that that's what it is, the plant that he is building. And one of tremendous size.
We even know which building it is, don't we?
Yes.
I think we do.
David Brinkley's full interview with President Reagan will be broadcast tomorrow night at 9 Central Time. On Wall Street, the Dow Jones Industrials today lost about 1.5 points, and the trading was moderate. When we come back, a new cancer treatment which looks very good in early testing. In medical news, the results of a new study on what could be a more efficient way to fight some forms of cancer. The study of so-called killer cells has just been published in the New England Journal of Medicine. And here is our medical correspondent, George Strait.
Scientists have found within some tumors cells that can kill the cancer, but there aren't very many, and the ones present aren't very active. Using an elaborate procedure, scientists at the National Institutes of Health collect these so-called tumor-infiltrating lymphocytes from cancer patients, grow them for 6 weeks, and then inject them back into the patient with a hormone, interleukin-2, which increases the cell's anti-tumor activity. 20 patients with advanced and incurable skin cancer were treated. In 11, tumors shrank in size. In 1, the tumors disappeared completely. Experts are encouraged, but cautious.
Unfortunately, I think on virtually all new therapeutic reports in cancer that are encouraging, the aftermath frequently leaves people somewhat disappointed.
But what has scientists excited is the approach. Currently, cancer is treated with surgery, radiation, or toxic drugs. Results are mixed. But the new approach uses the body's own immune system to fight the cancer. And if scientists are ever able to harness a patient's own defenses to kill their cancer, then a battle that's too often lost might finally be won. George Strait, ABC News, Chicago.
2 nuclear power plants got a go-ahead today from the government to start up their reactors. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission said that the Seabrook plant in New Hampshire may start low-power tests next month, even though its owners have filed for bankruptcy. And the Pilgrim plant in Massachusetts can go back into full service after being shut down for 3 years because of safety concerns. The end of a record-breaking spaceflight today. The Soviets say their 2 cosmonauts are feeling well. But if they are a bit wobbly-legged, it is perfectly understandable. They have just returned from a full year and a day in space. Here's ABC's Morton Dean.
Their spirits were sky high. 2 cosmonauts were heading home and into the record books. Vladimir Titov and Musa Manarov had been in space since December 21st of last year. A record made 3 hours longer today by a computer problem on the way home. The year-long flight far outdistanced the longest U.S. mission, Skylab, 84 days, November 1973 to February 1974. The U.S. worries about the Soviet edge in flight experience, but NASA's Samuel Keller says glasnost does extend to the space race.
They have been fairly open and fairly candid about making available to us the data resulting from their flights.
Keller adds the U.S. is receiving vital information about mental fatigue, thinning of blood, loss of calcium, muscle mass, and motor skills. Problems likely encountered by the 2 Soviet record breakers who were accompanied back to Earth today by a guest cosmonaut, a Frenchman, who had been in space for less than a month. Soviet mission planners see the apparently successful flight as an important endurance test for an even longer Soviet flight to Mars, planned for around the turn of the century. Morton Dean, ABC News, New York.
An anniversary today, the crossword puzzle, which challenges and often frustrates some 27 million Americans every day, is 75 years old. And here's a bit of trivia. The name was a mistake. That very first puzzle appeared in 1913 in the New York World. It was shaped like a diamond. It had 31 clues, and it was called a word cross. 4 weeks later, a typesetter goofed. He got it backwards, and the name Crossword stuck. When we come back, education is on the American agenda. Finding a better way to teach science. On the American agenda tonight, a look at one of the most serious challenges facing American education: how to get students interested in science. In a recent science achievement test of students in 17 countries, American teenagers ranked 14th. Only 7% of American 17-year-olds are considered adequately prepared for college-level science courses. Here's ABC's Ron Claiborne.
Does the sun revolve around the Earth, or does the Earth orbit the sun? 20% of American adults asked this question said the sun revolves around the Earth. They were wrong. Is a laser a beam of sound? No, it's a beam of light, but only 26% of those asked knew that. Does it matter that we don't know science?
The environment, space weapons, disease. What do we do with our waste? Where do we get our energy? These are all scientific, technological questions.
What has caused our nation to become scientifically illiterate? Educators blame several factors. A shortage of teachers trained in science, schools spending less money on science classes, in some cases not even offering them. For example, nearly a third of all high schools don't teach physics. But the biggest problem is the way science is taught in many schools, with textbooks, without experimentation. Educators know there's a better way.
Pull, 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 pull. Come on, keep it at 18.
Jean Harder, a high school science teacher in Wilmington, Delaware, is an ardent believer in hands-on teaching.
Look out, Leslie.
On this day, Harder's 11th grade physics students are riding skateboards down a hallway to study motion. While one student sits on the board, another pulls them along, keeping the measured effort or force steady.
There you go. Okay, at 18, what's happening?
Speeding up. The students experience that effect, discovering for themselves Newton's second law of motion, that an object will accelerate if a constant force is applied to it.
When you read a textbook, it gets boring. When you do the experiment, it's more learning.
What you read, you forget. What you see, you remember a little bit, but what you do is a part of you, and you remember it all your life, and you can build on that.
At Philadelphia's Franklin Institute, the hands-on exhibits have become a science mecca for young people. The concept has worked so well in getting children excited about science, the Institute has taken it a step further by bringing the museum to the children.
Press down real hard.
At Moffett Elementary, these fifth graders are studying energy and food, using materials from a kit the Franklin Institute makes up for Philadelphia schools.
Which of these three foods do you predict is going to burn the most?
The project is called Museum to Go. Its goal is to help teachers become more comfortable conducting hands-on classwork.
Read our temperature for us, please.
Before they lead the experiments, the teachers, who often have little or no training in science, attend a preparation workshop at the Institute. And once a year, the museum hosts a teacher overnight.
Could I see hands just first of whose elementary teachers say?
Hundreds of teachers come on their own time to try out experiments they can take back to their classrooms. The hands-on method seems one obvious answer to the science education problem. Yet innovative programs like these are the exception, not the rule. In fact, in the last 10 years, in junior high schools alone, hands-on classwork has declined 16%.
Once you find your life, you cannot move the microscope.
Schools blame lack of money for laboratory equipment and soaring insurance costs. And in the drive to improve test scores in reading and math, science has been neglected.
There's a lot at stake if we don't reverse this trend. For one thing, jobs. Getting a job and getting ahead are demanding more and better science skills. For another, America's ability to compete in an increasingly high-tech global market. Educators and school children have a solution, a national commitment to the kind of science education that works. Ron Claiborne, ABC News, Philadelphia.
And there is obviously an appetite for this kind of hands-on science education. The Franklin Institute tells us that about 425,000 individuals visited the museum this year alone, nearly half of whom were under 18. We'll have our final report in just a moment. To end this evening, a review of the top story of the day, and it is a bad story. The results of Flight 103 en route from Heathrow in London to New York and then on to Detroit. 240 passengers on board and a crew of 15. Pan American says there are no survivors that they are aware of among the crew or among the passengers. A number of people on the ground were injured as well and may have been killed. Many of them have been taken to hospitals in the two large towns along the Scottish-English border where Pan Am 103 went down after dark this evening. It was described by one person as rain of fire from the sky. The plane had taken off, it had reached altitude. There is no indication whatsoever of why the plane went down. There is talk of an implosion, that is to say a sudden loss of cabin pressure. There is talk of an explosion. Nobody knows whatsoever at this point exactly what they are talking about. But because the plane came down on the land, there is, in the view of many people, a good chance that they will recover the black box, the flight recorder, which will give them some indication of exactly what happened. There was no indication, according to Pan Am, from the pilot or from the co-pilot, that there was a sudden emergency on board. Flight 103 did not return home tonight. 240 people, passengers, and a crew of 15. We called it a Christmas disaster. It certainly is. I'm Peter Jennings. Good night.